So they've been in the river for 40 something years, almost 50 years. One guy said the gunner's really pretty good. Haven't seen any reports on it.
Me neither.
Glass.
No idea.
It's the algae or whatever. Fisheries. Same shit I put. Live right now.
Yep.
Hey, Facebook.
YouTube.
YouTube.
And then I share Facebook.
All right, I think I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Can everybody hear me? Not through? How about now? Better? Okay. So thanks for coming. This is a good turnout. If you haven't been to one of these events before, this is not your standard, I just get up and talk for an hour type of event. This is more of kind of a back and forth. I'm sure there's people in here who know a little bit more about this than I do, so this is mostly just me trying to facilitate a discussion around this issue. So at any point, if you have questions, if you have comments, these slides really are just here for me to show pretty pictures and to organize my thoughts, okay? I would like this to be more of a back and forth. How many people had heard of Asian carp before they came today? Good, so we've got some familiarity. So there is no one Asian carp, right? Asian carp is kind of a colloquial term for a bunch of different species. Grass carp, bighead carp, silver carp. Really the ones that we're worried about mostly are the silver carp, but they all have their own little problems. Interestingly enough, they were originally introduced into the United States in the 60s and 70s to control vegetation for fish farming. And kind of algal prevention in agricultural ponds and wastewater treatment facilities, and they were thought to be kind of ironically, a biocontrol for other invasive species that were in there. And kind of a reoccurring theme that comes with any invasive species is that when you try to introduce a species to control another species, you tend to create more problems. And that was one of the issues here. Of course, they escaped from some of these aquatic farms in the 70s, and they've been kind of slowly working their way through the Mississippi. Have moved all the way up to the Great Lakes, and now we have every reason to believe that they are probably established in the Great Lakes at this point as well. Since that point, the reason why we're here is they've been creating lots of problems as they've spread because they're just really good at outcompeting our native fish species. The big problems are they usually will feed on the smaller fish that are actually the prey for the commercial and sport fish that we really are concerned about. So there's ecological concerns about them kind of taking over an ecosystem and changing it and manipulating it in ways that we can't easily reverse. There's also economic concerns for many people is that there's lots of sport fishing, there's lots of revenue that comes in from sport fishing, and there is some concern that these fish will take over, reduce the food species for things like bass and crappie and other sunfish that people like to fish for. There's some new evidence that suggests that they won't be as damaging for sport fisheries, but it's still unknown, right? This is still something that we're trying to figure out, and of course there's lots of ecological impacts as well. There's also a public health problem for the silver carp especially. When they are disturbed, so when the boat engines kick in, this disturbs the fish, agitates them, and the thing that they do when they're agitated is they jump. So it's kind of beautiful when a whale does it. It's not so nice when a 60-pound carp does it and lands in your face. So it looks funny, but these things can grow up to 60 pounds. So you can imagine getting hit with a 60-pound fish when you're not expecting it flying through the water. Can be bad. The U.S. Geological Survey has actually classified water skiing in many lakes that have Asian carp as extremely dangerous. So it's like at the level of backcountry skiing in terms of danger. So here's where they're this is where we, according to Tennessee Fish and Wildlife Resources Agency, this is where we think they currently are in the state. So remember that they originated from over here in Arkansas. They moved up the Mississippi, and they've been in here for a while, hanging out in these kind of tributaries that come straight off of the Mississippi. But if you remember, they had to go up and get into the Ohio and then come in through the Cumberland to get into the rest of the system, and so it's taken a little bit of time for them to get there. They have moved through, and this is where the red lines are designating what we know to be established populations. So there's a difference between established populations and just where you see them. We have actually caught them, I say we, not me, but folks have actually caught them down here in Chickamauga, but it's not clear that they have established in that area. It's probably reasonable to believe that they probably have established in that area, but it's not confirmed.
There's nothing to stop them.
There's nothing to stop them. So there are dams, right? And so the dams are hopefully the thing that will slow them, but they seem to be very good at getting through locks, right? So, this is a good question, right? You do have a physical barrier along this system that you could stop them, but of course there's lots of economic damages that come from shutting down these locks and preventing barge traffic to move through. There was a big concern about keeping them out of the Great Lakes, and there was a proposal going around that they were just going to shut down several of the locks that would lead from the Illinois River into Lake Michigan, and that was not very popular. For a number of reasons, which I'll get to in a minute, but there are a lot of big things you can do, only to have them undone if a fisherman accidentally drops some bait fish into the river above where your barrier is, and then they establish above where you built your fence, right? So those are they seem like no-brainer things to do, just put in a barrier, but they can obviously backfire on you.
Can you state whether the red line for the Tennessee River continues down into Georgia and then comes back to Tennessee?
Yeah, so as far as I know,
Where do the carp go in Georgia?
as far as I know, somebody can tell me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, they have established down here in North Alabama.
Okay.
So yeah, I think you can basically imagine them being all the way up to Nickajack in terms of establishment at this point. You might know anything current on this? This map is a couple years old, so I imagine that there is some updates
The
on it.
concern right now is Chickamauga.
Yeah, it is right here that they're concerned about.
Yeah, and into Chickamauga already, but not established.
Right.
And there's not much between there and here.
Yep. Watts Bar is your last line of defense, I guess, right?
Yep.
So the good thing is the barge traffic does slow down as you move up, right? But still, all you need is one for them to get through the system. Okay, so kind of give you an idea of what we're up against. It might seem fairly straightforward to just go in and pull these things out of the river. So this is what's known as electrofishing, that was going on at Barkley Dam in Kentucky. If I can get this to run. It's not running. Well, it would have been neat. Here, I would find it. We can make this work. Because this is a cool video. I have to watch the ad.
A long ad. There you go.
All right, here you go.
Oh, yeah.
This seems silly, right? I mean, so they're electroshocking them. That's why they're popping up into the water, right? It'll stun them for a short amount of time. It doesn't kill them. And then these folks are going through and just like mad trying to scoop them out of the water and put them in the boat, right? This isn't a viable way to control them, right? You see, this isn't going to work in terms of control. Really, what this is to give them an idea of how many are there, right? This is kind of their best way of doing surveillance to figure out where they are and how many there are. But this is not a viable way of getting them out of the rivers. I think the take home that you get from this is, the question I get asked a lot is, can we get these, remove these from the rivers in Tennessee? And the answer is almost certainly no. They are here. Where they're already currently established, you can see that because they reproduce so quickly, and it's very hard to get them out of the waters, that you're probably not going to prevent them, right? Within this field of economics that I do, there's this concept known as a stock effect, which more or less means that it's fairly easy to catch stuff when there's a lot of it, but it's really costly to catch the last 2 or 3 of something, right? So you can imagine that, okay, yeah, we can pull a couple thousand out of the lake doing this, but you're not going to get those last 2. And those last 2 are just going to undo all the efforts that you had. And you've got to tell these poor guys that they just scooped for nothing because they've just repopulated that entire area. So let's go ahead and rule out the idea that we're going to make Tennessee carp free. Okay? I think the next thing you want to talk about is what are the management strategies that we have. And I like to think of invasive species managed as this 3-legged stool. You really have to have all of these things. One is prevention, and it's prevention of these areas that aren't currently established, right? So go ahead and forget the red lines. Let's prevent invasions into the places where it's not already established, okay? The second thing is control, and that's control in 2 ways. One, slowing the spread, right? So it could be that you're not going to prevent spread up to Chickamauga, but you could slow it, right? And you can obviously control the size of the populations that are at Barkley and all these other areas where they've already established, right? You won't get rid of them, but you can knock them back a little bit. And then the final thing is surveillance. You kind of have to know where they are in order to know what you want to do, and you kind of need to know how many there are, okay? So I want to talk a little bit about this distinction between prevention and control. A lot of people will argue, you know what, we need to go full in, double down on prevention, and just put all of the federal money or state money that we're going to invest in this toward preventing them from establishing anywhere else. It's good in that you'll be able to keep them out of places where you want, but the benefits of that are kind of unknown, right? You could invest in prevention, spend a whole lot of money to put in a barrier of some sort to keep them out. And like I said, only someone may come through and accidentally release carp above your barrier, and it's not effective anymore, okay? So prevention sounds great because it will essentially keep them out of these areas where you want them, but it's a risky investment from an economic standpoint. On the other hand, the decision makers are going to know what they get with control, okay? If you go into an area where carp are established and you do electroshocking or you do whatever you're going to do to try to knock back the population, you can guess what you're going to get pretty well. We're going to get a 30% reduction in populations for the next year, right? That may be it, right? It may be a year. But at least you know what you're going to get. So you can think risky investment that may keep them out of a river but may not, versus sure thing investment that will have a smaller impact on the population overall. Now, there's been numerous economic studies that have gone through, and they've said, okay, well, when you're looking at this, what this means is that you have to use both, right? There's some optimal mix of prevention versus control. You don't want a strategy that puts all your money into prevention. You don't want a strategy that puts all your money into control. You need a little bit of both, okay? So that's why I say that at least 2 of those legs have to have this prevention versus control aspect. And then the third thing that you got to have as well is this surveillance. You have to obviously know where they're established so that you can determine whether you're going to make investments and you don't waste the funds, right? Preventing invasion of a reservoir where carp have already established is kind of a waste of resources, so you don't want to spend money on prevention if it's already invaded. This was a debate that was going on around Illinois when they were trying to keep the carp out of Lake Michigan, was they were saying, well, they're probably already in Lake Michigan, and we're going to spend millions of dollars to try to keep them out, only to find out that they're already there, right? Yeah.
How are you defining present from established?
So, established meaning that they're, Dan, you could probably speak to this. Basically meaning that they can reproduce it on their own?
Yes, established means have a reproductive population.
Yeah.
And I heard that a female carp can lay 50 million eggs in a period? Is that, what is the truth?
I've heard that number too. I don't really know. Are there biologists in the room that would know an actual number on this? It's just a lot, right? There's so many.
30 million, 327,
It doesn't matter.
400.
Point two.
Gives us a base to work with.
It's a lot, right? And so this is why I say if you leave 2 or 3 fish, you're gonna, all of the efforts that you've had to knock the population back to 2 or 3 fish are gonna get undone pretty
Are
quickly.
you gonna talk about their breeding process?
No, I'm an economist. If there's someone in here who knows about the breeding process, I'm happy to have someone talk about that.
They lay a lot of eggs, but they don't all make it to adulthood.
Right.
So when you hear that number, that's just eggs. That's not how many are fertilized, not how many make it into being an adult reproductive carp.
And so approximately how many would make it into?
I don't have the number on my head. I just know that it's a drastic drop
It's
from
drastic.
no eggs laid to adults surviving.
But they also just lay eggs in the
Probably less
water.
than 1%.
Right.
What's 1% of a million?
Right.
Times however many
They
fish.
just lay eggs in the water column, they don't bed. And so, you know, and they don't go up little creeks to breed.
So what we need to do is convince people that carp are good to eat.
I'm getting there. I'm getting there.
Yeah,
I like this
okay,
idea.
so, the little bit of control that we saw in that video is pretty puny, but you could devise commercial harvest boats that could more effectively harvest large amounts of these things and either turn them into people food or dog food or cat food or something, and then making an
Fertilizer.
economic prosperity out of them.
Right. So I'm going to run through a few things that have been talked about. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
That's precisely one of the problems we have today. They monetize the fish by paying for the netting.
Yeah.
And once you monetize the fish, you will never get rid of them. That last sentence on your prior slide where it said purposeful introductions will take place, you'll see that exactly happening. And then when you try and eradicate them, then you'll have people sitting there saying, you're taking away my living. So that's a public policy issue right there. So why aren't we spending money looking at solutions like what they've used in the Great Lakes for the lamprey, where they have a multi-pronged approach where they have barriers, and they've also used scientific methods for biological and chemical solutions for them rather than netting. And they're fairly successful. There's more walleye in Lake Erie now than there ever has been since they've surveyed the lake, ever. And so it's an ongoing problem. You never eradicate them. But I think in the last 10 years, I've seen marks on fish coming up with lamprey marks maybe 10 times. We've boated maybe 3 lamprey still attached to steelhead, and I own a charter sport fishing business on Lake Erie. So there's a lot of days on the lake that vessel runs.
A question for that gentleman. Isn't there a difference between, I would call it a parasite? The lamprey versus another species of fish, as far as eradicating with chemicals or that method?
Why? Is this one?
Just, I would think biology.
I don't believe so. You know, they were impacting the fish by killing them. Similar to what these carp will do, just in a different means. I mean, the carp are going to kill the sport fish, the other fish, by eating their eggs, eating their fry, messing up, muddying the waters where the sport fish will breed and where their eggs are hatched at. And so, to a certain degree, I don't see a difference in that. The methods they went after is they found that if they sterilized the males were territorial, and they would work against their own kind by keeping other breeding males out. They put spermicides in the water where they breed that prevented the eggs from hatching, and they also had the barriers, weir dams, that kept them from going further. And so it was the approach that you're saying. But my concern is, at least in Tennessee, we're not spending money properly in chasing after these other techniques. The only thing I've seen actively pursued with TWRA money is going after the netting side of things. And we're sitting in an institution here that has the capability to do that research, as well as Tennessee Tech down the road. Both have very good fisheries programs. Why is there not a large amount of money going into those to figure out a solution?
And when you say the netting program, could you describe for everybody what you mean by that netting program?
Well, my understanding is that, I think, more TWRA, I think, funded some nets. They have commercial fishermen who are netting the fish out of the lakes. I saw one of the boats running down I-40 on Tuesday, actually.
But they're just paying for the nets for these folks, and then they're going out.
Subsidizing.
Subsidized.
So they're paying for the fish that they catch, or are they just subsidizing the nets?
Subsidizing the pounds, they caught the
They're
catch.
paying, so that, a bounty program.
And they're catching adult fish,
Yeah.
which doesn't solve the problem because the young are still coming up.
Mhm.
And 10 years down the road, if UT or someone does come up with a solution for this, they're gonna be crying, you're taking away my living. And so they need to be very, very careful with how they do that. And as far as getting people to like to eat them, do you want to give up fishing for your stripers or fishing for your bass or fishing for your trout, everything else for these fish? Because they'll take over the waters. They've already shown they can do that.
In answer to your first question, that there is one big difference between lamprey and the Asian carp. The lamprey are anadromous, so they only go back, they only breed in certain streams, generally the stream they were born in. And that's a pretty small fraction of the streams that go into the Great Lakes. So it's a weak point in their life cycle where you can find them and you can kill them by various means. However, it is certainly true that over at least 30 years now, there's been really substantial research on lamprey biology that's led to a whole bunch of innovations that have greatly lessened their toll. It's too late for some fish that went extinct. But there's the sterile male situation that was just described. There are two pheromones, one of which attracts the females, the other which attracts adults up to their streams to breed. Those have both been synthesized and field tested now. There's improved lampricides, et cetera, et cetera. So the problem, it's not, it's problems and it's expensive, but it's a small fraction of what it was. And that kind of research has not gone into the biology of any of these Asian carp, except to some extent grass carp.
Thank you both. And that's just because the grass carp have been here longer than
Yeah,
everything?
grass carp have been here longer, and they can use triploid grass carp.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So I guess along the lines of this conversation with regards to, there's an economy of bass fishing, which is a significant boon for rural communities along the Tennessee River and Cumberland, right? So I guess from an economic standpoint, and I'm sure that you maybe haven't done that work yet, but what is the economy of big bass, right, versus the potential economy of big carp? And is there room for both? Or does the potential benefit or potential loss of the big bass economy on the rivers, would that actually outweigh and push, suppress the potential affinity towards carp because that's my new economy or that's part of my new economy? You understand what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So what's the kind of, what do those stacks of dollars look like or potential dollars look like? What's at stake?
It's, so I haven't done that analysis yet. That would be an interesting thing to figure out, but, it's sort of the bird in the hand, right? You know right now that you have a pretty lucrative economy built around bass fishing. And many cities, many towns in Tennessee have basically built their local economy around that, right? And so do you want to give that up for some unknown value of this carp fishery, right? That is going to be subsidized by the government to some extent, which could go away at any point. The other hand is that makes it seem like you have that choice, right? You may not have that choice. You may take a hit on the bass fishery anyway, and so it may not be just you don't get the either or, right? But it's a good question that I don't know exactly what the dollars and cents would tell you if you were willing to trade one versus the other.
My only comment on that is, it's not just bass. I happen to live on Ecological Lake. My property value will decrease substantively who wants carp jumping on my dock, taking out my grandchildren. So it's way beyond the bass fishing economy. I've seen numbers where it's hundreds to one if the carp take over and they're really in land between the lakes, Barkley and Kentucky Lake. Boating is down, tournaments are down, property values are down. So the trade-off, the bass is only one small item. And the economics I've seen would tell me, spend all the money you can right now, because once they're here in Loudon, once they're in Watts Bar, once they're in Tellico, I'm gonna sell my house, because the economic, who's gonna buy it? Nobody. So good point on bass, but it's only a small chunk of the real economic impact.
So I think there's a fundamental question that we all have to ask ourselves, which is how do we define an invasive species? There is the biological question of what is invasive, that would say that it wasn't originally here, and you probably take a second step and say that it has very large detrimental impacts to the ecology of the system. An economic definition would say that the costs of these things outweigh the benefits, right? And so lots of agricultural animals, cows, chickens, those are all invasive species, right? But we tolerate them because the benefits outweigh the costs. And so if that's your definition, then economic incentives for fixing this thing can look advantageous, because they may tolerate the carp, but they will eventually increase the benefits of carp to such an extent that potentially outweigh the costs, right? Potentially. Of course, if you don't buy that argument, you say, no, that's not the definition that I use, my definition is more of a biological definition, then the economic incentives the netting programs and things like that can obviously look like a bonehead thing to do, right? Because the major concern, I don't know if this was obvious to everybody, the major concern obviously is that if we go through and create these bounty programs, or we start to subsidize a fish processing industry around these fish, people are going to take a fish, move it to where they want it so that they can more easily fish, right? I'm a little skeptical of this argument, only because I think we can put the processing facilities in places where it won't make sense for people to move them, right? Now we know that carp, the market for carp requires that it's very fresh, okay? Any place where they're selling these, they have a very short time horizon where they have to get the fish out of the water and get it on ice. One of the things that TWRA has done is they've tried to put ice coolers in places where they want them to catch fish, because that way they can come back to the dock, get the carp on ice right away. Carp starts to smell pretty bad pretty quick if you don't get it on ice. So I think we can control, if you moved, say, thinking back to the map, right? If you tried to take fish from the Cumberland and move it over above Chickamauga or even above Watts Bar, if we just make sure the processing facilities are out here, it's not going to make economic sense for them to catch them above Watts Bar, because by the time they drive into the processing facilities, it's going to be wasted fish. So I think we can mitigate that to some point, but it still gets back to the bigger question about how you define invasive species. Okay? And that'll be a question we obviously have to ask, because it really breaks down those two decisions. Any other comments? So I'm just going to run through some of the things that I know that are currently going on. Within that prevention column, there is the barrier method, build a fence and hope they don't get around it. There are essentially the auditory barriers, where you install basically a large boom box underneath the water, and it puts out a noise that the carp don't like. Okay? Keeps them away from the dam. It doesn't kill them by any means, but it keeps them away from the dam, with the idea being is then that the boats can come through, the water that enters the lock will not be infested with carp, and that they can then keep boat traffic moving through the locks. Bubble barriers are another way to do this. It literally just shoots out a pulse of bubbles that the carp don't like to try to keep them away from the dam. They're still testing. I think they have been installed in places. There's a couple places where they've been installed up around the Great Lakes, and they debate the efficiency or the effectiveness of these things. With science, I think the main thing that questions their effectiveness is the degree to which someone's just going to take some bait fish and release them above that barrier, right? I think that's gonna be the thing that would undo it, potentially more than maybe just the science part of it.
You got the electric fencing too.
You got electric fencing that actually do shock the fish, yeah.
Why are they being sold as bait fish?
They're not being sold as bait fish, but here's, so, you see these 4, 3 of them are not carp, 1 of them is. I honestly don't even know which one. Is it this one? I think it's this one, but I'm not sure. Dan? I think it's this one, but you can't tell, right? So these are standard shad. These are, the 3 on top are shad, I'm pretty sure. So this is a standard bait fish. So you can see how it would be very easy for you to say, well, that looks like my bait fish. A lot of times what happens after you fish, either the bait gets off or you take the rest of your bait fish and you chuck them in the water after you're done fishing, right? And so in that respect, it would be easy for carp to slip into the bait system and get out that way. So Tennessee has done what a bunch of states have done, which is ban the transport of bait fish across lakes and rivers. That sounds good, but it's not going to be terribly effective, I'm afraid, because you just can't, even if you wanted to spend the money on inspection, you're going to need some pretty good fish biologists to be able to distinguish between these two. And you'll need them at every single boat ramp.
But this isn't how they're presented in the wild. When you see the bait fish, they're alive. When you catch them in a net, they're alive. They're not dead laying on the surface with a horrible picture taken of it. I mean, the way the fish moves and the way the fish acts when it's alive is going to be a lot more telltale than looking at a picture of the side of a fish.
Do you think most people would be able to still tell the difference?
I don't know. I've never seen one of these, so I can't say.
Yeah, I don't know.
I do a lot with live shad. And where I net here at Chickamauga, Watts Bar, we don't have them. I haven't seen them. I spend a lot of time on the water. I'm a commercial guy like you. We run boats every day.
So the photographs I've seen online are, I mean, this is projected picture, so it's lousy this is just poor resolution.
Sure.
The ones I've seen online, it's pretty clear. You can tell the difference between them. But even if you're, looking at incidental, if the eggs are free flow in the water column, they're going to get on ducks and things, and they'll get transported. So a barrier will slow things down, but you will never stop it. So you've got to come up with other alternatives. Regardless, they will get there.
And the barriers are millions of dollars. Just to throw it out there. I mean, how much does it cost?
The barriers slow down the introduction and will allow other means to have a chance to keep the numbers low.
Sure. Yeah. It's just important to remember when you're investing in these things, it's not total prevention, right? You're spending millions of dollars to slow the spread and not prevent it.
I think identification is number one here in preventing the spread of the fish, because not everybody's going to come to these classes. Not everybody's going to obey the law, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So, you got Joe Blow out there, he's fishing, he's got his net, he pulls in fish, puts them in a bucket, takes them home, puts them in his aquarium.
Yeah.
People release captive fish all the time. No law that's passed is actually going to 100% prevent the spread of these fish. So it's just something like you talked about, the prevention is the hardest part. The control is really where our strong suit is. And in identifying these fish, a picture like this up here on the screen, yeah, it's hard to tell because it's a horrible picture and the fish are dead. Who knows how long they've been dead? They may be preserved. I took it in Irish class, so I saw all his minnows and we were counting scales and this and that. So I think there needs to be more education in terms of identification before these fish are actually going to be preventative, to be spread around all over the place. And addressing something another gentleman said about his property value, there's no evidence that once the fish are here, that they're going to take over in the numbers that they have in Barkley, Pickwick, and Kentucky. It's a different environment. The ecosystem is completely different, and the requirements that these fish have to breed is similar to a striped bass. They need flowing water. Their eggs are semi-buoyant. They hatch, or they lay the eggs. They roll through the water column with current, and then they hatch. So they have very specific requirements, and there's evidence that this Asian carp, there's gaps in the year classes where they had unsuccessful spawning years. You would expect to see 1 pound fish, 2 pound fish, 3 pound fish, but there's gaps now, in which, to me shows that there is a weakness in their spawning, and that there's a chance And I like the lamprey idea about the sterilization or, spermicide in the water, because we can identify where these carp go to spawn. They're gregarious, they school, they go to one place to breed, and if we know where that is and approximately when they breed, we can insert something to prevent the hatching of the eggs. I think that's probably the best thing I've heard yet.
Mhm. There's this concept when you do invasive species where control is known as what they call a weak link public good, which more or less just means that it only works if everybody does it, right? And so all you need is one person to not pay attention, and it undoes all the good deeds that everyone else has done, right? So it's not like pollution. A lot of the things we think about in pollution, where if everybody just cuts back on pollution a little bit, there's a benefit, right? It doesn't quite work out that way here, because one bad deed can kind of undo everyone else's good deeds.
I don't know if the fish, like, if that one deed is as bad as you might think it is, because you need to have enough of them or they're going to breed and have a sustainable population. So if one person puts the fish in the water and there's not enough of them to have a young and then continue on, then that'll die off. So if you can get enough people to keep that incidence of accidental introduction low, you're not going to have these huge populations be able to sustain themselves.
Maybe,
So history has proven that there's never 100% compliance with any of these regulations. So is there any projection for when Asian carp are just going to be nationwide?
Like common carp.
Since it is inevitable?
I don't know of anyone that's put like a expected time of arrival on on them or anything like that.
It is accepted that it is coming, right?
I think it's fairly well accepted that at least through most of this system that they're going to be here. Someone can argue with me, but I know at this point it's just an argument, right? I don't know that anyone has a good idea of it.
One of the costs certainly would be enforcement. And if you look at some things that are occurring in other states, for example, Montana has a very strict regulation with respect to invasive species coming into waterways. Every single vessel in Montana going in, even if you're passing through Montana, trailering on the interstate, is required to be inspected and cleaned out. And the fines are very heavy if they happen to find a dead zebra mussel somewhere inside one of the engine cooling sections on the vessel. There was a commercial hauler that was actually fined for that in the past year. We've seen the zebra mussel for one of the Great Lakes. They've managed to get that under control. Norris saw a massive zebra mussel, and that, I believe, was caused by the number of people that own and visit from Ohio to Norris. They brought it down on the boats. And so you're going to have to fund, perhaps fund more TWRA people to perform inspections and look at what bait's going in and out of the lakes. Let the professionals do it then. Or change some way that the bait fish is caught or only allow commercial. But again, people can still circumvent the laws. Laws don't prevent it from occurring, but it reduces it. And if you can at least eliminate the ignorance of what you're doing, that'll go a far way.
So how much are we worried about that same type of boat transport for Asian carp eggs?
I have no idea how long they would survive.
I wouldn't think very long, but I don't know.
Well, what about sitting in the water in boats? Any idea?
I mean, I know Asian carp, you can drive hours and days with, zebra mussels, right? With them on your boat and then put in somewhere else, many states away.
You take a decent sized boat that comes out of the water, you think boats are dry, but a 30-foot sport fishing boat will have 6 inches of water sitting in it at any given time. That's a couple 100 gallons. Smaller boat, an 18-footer, you've got enclosed compartments. You've got the live wells with all the water lines that run through those that suck the water out of the lake to circulate in the live wells. You very well could have eggs sitting in that too.
Mm-hmm.
So unless you're going to go to the requiring sanitizing, running Clorox through all the water lines and through all the boats, you're going to move them around like that too.
Yeah. So following up on that point, Dan, even if you agree that it's inevitable that they're going to get here, that doesn't mean that the optimal response is to just sit back and do nothing, right? I mean, I think there's still some benefit to slowing them. And if you thought, well, they're definitely going to be here in 10 years, I think people would still be willing to pay or willing to do something to push it back to 20, right? I think there is this perception that when we're honest with the public and we say, well, it's inevitable that they're gonna end up in most of this Tennessee River system at some point, that people just want to throw up their hands and say, well, then we shouldn't spend any money on it. I think that's probably the wrong response. There is a value to delaying when they get here and when this occurs, or to keep the population under somewhat of control.
You know, that Montana inspection system also makes the point you made earlier. It is expensive. It's expensive to enforce, but Montana has invested quite a bit in research on cutting down that cost. So, for example, now they use dogs. They've trained dogs to detect zebra mussels. They do it really well.
Really?
Dogs in the airport, it's a lot cheaper than having people. Montana also did an analysis of which stations have to be open, how many hours, and how inconvenient it is to make people go at different hours, longer distances. And so they've minimized the cost, and it was from both biological and it's ongoing. Not only economic, but biological research.
In the state, from lake to lake requires it to go through some
Yep.
inspection and sanitation. Some of the lakes
Yep.
are already affected.
Yeah, and they're working now with olfactometers, although the dogs are probably the best olfactometer.
That's pretty good, yeah.
So we're gonna have carp sniffing dogs.
I know. It seems reasonable, right?
Yeah.
You would think that would be easier than a zebra mussel.
For my own edification, if a 30-pound animal would need a lot of calories every day to sustain itself, and if you have gazillions of them like we saw in that video, what is it that what's in the water that's sustaining them as a food source, and why isn't that being considered as a solution to a barrier?
So someone else is going to know more than I, but I think the idea is that a lot of the things they're feeding on are supporting things that we also care about. So they're feeding on the fry of the sport fish that we're interested in. And so if you thought one way to control this would be to go through and kind of knock back what it is that they're feeding on, that may have the unintended consequence of hurting the thing you were actually trying to save.
One of the problems with invasive species is that they tend to be generalist feeders. So it's not that there's a single point of food for Asian carp. They'll eat pretty much anything. So you'd have to basically annihilate all of the food in the river to annihilate their food source.
What makes them invasive is they eat anything, right?
They eat plankton. A lot of them eat plankton. Now, there are a number of Asian carp species, I think there are 4 that are present in the U.S. now. So, grass carp obviously were raised to eat grass. And that's been very effective, but silver carp, I think, is the species that we're generally talking about here. And I believe, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, that's a plankton species. So they can outcompete our fisheries current fish by just reducing the plankton. But if we have, as Marilyn suggested, if we have a lake that's not heavy in plankton, i.e. it's a fairly deep lake that warms up rather slowly in the spring and summer, there's a good water turnover in it, it's not deoxygenated on the bottom, you don't get plankton bloom on it, then you're more protected, I think, against something like an Asian carp invasion than if you have a eutrophication type lake with heavy plankton bloom. That's the worst case scenario, as far as my understanding is. One other gentleman raised a potential solution, and that would be to eat our way out of it. In other words, just cook them up and eat them, collect them and eat them, make that profitable. I think that's already been tried in Illinois. I think they actually paid restaurant chefs to take free carp, provide it for free, and see if they could serve it on the dinner table, and that didn't work. And the reason was that they're too bony. They could not get good fillets and just would not, they just gave up trying to make fillets out of the fish and serve it. So now you're down to the point where you're gonna have to feed it to animals, and there's not enough money in it to make that work, is my understanding.
So on that eat them front, so obviously these carp are different than most invasive species, right? If you think of kudzu, there is no market value for kudzu. There is a market value for carp, right? Current price is too low to incentivize anyone to go out and catch them. So we have these bounty programs where we're essentially paying folks to go catch them. I know Kentucky's bounty is like 15 cents a pound or something. I don't know what Tennessee's is at this point, but I imagine it's comparable. That obviously is not sustainable. You can't imagine that the state's going to continue to pay these bounties over time, over the long haul, which they're going to need to do. So the idea of kind of trying to foster some sort of market to get people to do this voluntarily makes a lot of sense. Now, there is a lot of perception, negative perception of carp, right? Because we think of carp as bottom feeding carp that are gross, which we have no problem with catfish, but for some reason with carp we don't like it. But we think of carp being these bottom feeding species that are very dirty and we don't want to eat them. These Asian carp are not bottom feeding, right? They're actually feeding from the top. I mean, they're really not much different than any other bass or anything else we eat. The major hindrance is the boniness, right? I know there was a group out of LSU that was essentially trying to create a machine that was going to debone them and turn them into pulp that you'd essentially make like crab cakes out of. So forget the fillet, you would just have carp cakes. They had a way to do it pretty cost effectively, right? I think we can get around the bony problem. I think it's still it's just the human perception of carp as being such a dirty fish that nobody wants to eat it, right? I'm fully convinced that we have technology to fix the bony problem. I'm not convinced we have the technology to convince people to eat carp when they've already decided carp's a dirty fish, right? The alternative, obviously, is that we ship them to places where they love to eat carp. Carp is a delicacy in China. They pay high dollar for it. The ironic part is they're actually, I don't know if they're technically, I think they're threatened throughout a lot of China because they've harvested them to the point where they've driven them down quite a bit. So the irony is that in China, they can't keep them around. They've almost harvested them to extinction in places. And here we have so many that we can't get them over there. So the question is, well, why can't we just export them to China, right? And so I know the state has considered, well, maybe we should subsidize the processing facilities. The processing facility is the kink in the chain that's going to keep them from going.
I think Kentucky's doing that, are they not?
Kentucky is doing that. A couple of facilities within the state where they have actually subsidized the processing facility. My understanding is that the Chinese prefer them fresh. This is what I've been told from a guy who works at a processing facility, is that the Chinese prefer them fresh. They don't want them frozen. And so obviously it's much more costly to move a fish across the ocean if it's fresh than if it's frozen.
Just like fresh sushi, which is actually frozen before it's served.
Yeah, and you think,
Realize that.
I mean, all these fish are frozen, right? And you think all these boats are out in the water for days, weeks, right? So that
Carp has a public perception problem. You need a marketing team to get a cute name, like tilapia, and then serve it on a fine platter.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Folks in my class, I know you have a class right after this, so please go real quickly and continue on with the Q&A. Thank you.
Has anyone looked at the Asian carp roe to see if there's a caviar angle on these fish? And the caviar bring high price from sturgeon and paddlefish. You can tell they're tiny eggs.
You know, all the time in schools that net them.
I don't know about that. That's something they probably haven't figured out.
Charles, isn't there a history, so the tilapia example was the one I was going to bring up. Isn't there a history of rebranding fish from things we think are disgusting, giving them a new name and marketing them better?
Yeah.
And is there some reason that won't work here?
No, there's no reason. I mean, Chilean sea bass,
Antarctic toothfish.
Yeah, the Patagonian toothfish, right? That's a technical language. Nobody wants to eat Patagonian toothfish, but they line up to eat Chilean sea bass, right? Crayfish is another example. So the Chinese used to think that crayfish was nasty, and the government actually, because they were trying to find alternative protein sources, maybe because they were eating too much carp, they actively, the government actively engaged in this rebranding program to convince the Chinese people that crayfish were perfectly fine to eat. And now people love them. So this is an example that this is potentially, everybody asked me, well, what does this actually work for? Because Chilean sea bass is a slightly different issue, right? Because it wasn't invasive. It was a case where some marketing genius just wanted to commercialize and increase the value of their fish, right? But there are at least that crayfish example, which crayfish were invasive in China, this particular type of crayfish. There is at least that example that I can find where they have successfully rebranded an invasive species to convince people to eat it. So there's no reason. But that probably gets out of, I probably have to talk to marketing people.
Marketing department.
You need your Don Drapers of the world to figure out how to.
Change the UT from the balls to the silver carp.
Maybe. What do they call it in Kentucky? What do they, Kentucky blue snapper? Is that the word?
I don't know.
I think that's what they call them in Kentucky.
Yeah.
So it could be the orange snapper.
The orange snapper.
Tennessee Ruffy.
Tennessee Ruffy.
Ruffy, there you go.
Orange Ruffy, yeah, I like that. That's good.
Yeah, river salmon.
And I want to walk a silver carp into the stadium.
But again, I think all the benefits of these programs are all, if we're all on board, that the idea of an invasive species is one where the cost outweighs benefits, right? Because again, buying on board with this will say, well, we're going to create an industry around harvesting carp. And if you're not on board with that, and I know Dan's not on board with it, if you're not on board with that, then this seems like a bonehead thing to do. Why are we going to build an industry around carp where people's livelihoods are going to depend on this invasive species? Clearly, they're not going to go away at that point. So you have to accept the fact that this definition of an invasive species is just, we could potentially flip an invasive species to a commercially valuable product. Right?
Well, you're willing to give up all your native fish to do that, or a large number of native fish, and change the entire, one of the economic powers locally, which is tourism. Because there's no tourism factor in silver carp, and it's a negative factor rather than a positive factor.
It would depend on how successful your rebranding campaign is.
You're not going to have many people buying $75,000 boats with 400 horsepower motors on the back to drive down the lake and get hit in the face by a car.
Sure. But if it's a successful rebranding program where you're actually harvesting a ton of them and you could potentially knock them back to the point like they are in China, then you don't necessarily have to give them up, right? I think your point is right. If the harvesting program doesn't work at all, then yeah, I can see how you're basically just giving up one for the other. But if you're on board with the idea that these actually may knock back the population to some extent, then there is a control aspect to it that is potentially beneficial as well.
The problem is that your definition of cost is monetary. And the point that was just raised about the decline and loss of native species, for which there may not be a market value. In fact, undoubtedly, most there isn't. You're not in cost. So I can't agree with your definition of
So we could, and you can extend it, right? It doesn't have to be that it's just commercially valuable, right? It would be a question of how much people were willing to pay to preserve an endangered native species that's not commercially valuable.
Once again, that's a monetary, you're monetizing something that can easily be.
Well, it's anthropogenic, right? So I'm saying anthropogenic costs, not necessarily commercial, right? But it is a cost that humans would have. So I'll give you that. It would be a cost that humans would put on things.
So I could stand on the grounds of not allowing an invasive species to impact my native species, and we can look at what's taking place out west with respect to the wolves versus the elk, which is a major negative economic impact into the regions because they're decimating the elk and deer herds. And the argument is that the wolves were native and therefore they should be allowed, but without predators and you know, we cannot have a natural ecosystem anymore because we affect it. We're part of the natural ecosystem. And they want to remove that, or they have removed that in those areas. And quite frankly, it's fairly dangerous in a number of areas of Montana because of the bears and because of the wolves. I was out there last year and had them around me all the time. But that's natural. And I can accept that. When I walk outside there, I realize that I'm not necessarily at the top of the food chain at any given moment. So my argument would be, these fish don't belong here. They shouldn't be here. I don't care if it's an economic boost for someone. It doesn't exist today. I don't want it here.
So she's been waiting, hold on.
So in West Tennessee, in the Cross Creeks and LBL area, many farmers have been sending out their teenagers and stuff to go bow fishing to kill carp and alligator gar, which was up there earlier. And they're actually using them on hemp farms as nutrients for the plants, and they also have been doing that with tobacco plants. So they're not really a commercial use they're using it for, but they are getting a benefit out of it by hiring teenagers to go kill them and bring them back to the farms. So that's one use for them.
I think one thing we haven't talked about yet is our natural ecosystem. The TVA and Army Corps of Engineers chain of lakes is far from natural. You know, it was originally a river, we dammed it up, and now we're kind of dealing with the consequences of messing with nature. And the Great Lakes is a different example because they were here before us. And, you know, only in the last 90 to 100 years have we developed this system for flood control, power generation, recreation, et cetera. And now, you know, we've created a different environment where some of the native species have reduced. For example, walleye have just about disappeared when we had world record walleye prior to the system. And now you've got other species such as the shad, which I fish for, the bait fish that are basically overpopulated now. And I think that, you know, it's just like when you develop New York City and the pigeons come in and they overpopulate. It's a human, you know, like rats and mice to a human population. It's just something we've done to the environment. No one's really said it yet, but when we created this somewhat permanent change, at least in our lifetime, to the river system, we're just kind of having to deal with the spin-off from that with these carp.
If I might add, on the market for carp, I don't have a problem with that where they already exist, but where they don't exist, I don't want them. So we can talk about, I don't think any of these is a solution. These are solutions. And right now, my sense of the state of Tennessee is talking about it, not doing a damn thing about it. We just talk about it. It's expensive. I know up in the Illinois River, they're spending in excess of $50 million on a barrier that's currently under construction. I don't want these carp, candidly, in my lake or where they are. You know, I don't know where the barrier is, because that's an issue. You could build the barrier where they already exist. The other thing I would share with yesterday, I've been Asian carping for the last couple of days. Dr. Joseph, he's a fisheries biologist. I don't know if anybody knows him on Watts Bar Lake, and he's been a real rebel rouser on getting the state to do something about this Asian carp business. And I don't remember the exact title of his organization on Watts Bar, but if you search around, look for Dr. Joseph, he's been, last week he was at state legislature talking about this. He's been up in this area. So in addition to today, I would suggest if you really have an interest, look at his online stuff and contact him. He's a big barrier guy, but we better do it now. He would go so far as to say, let's close the locks, at least on Watts Bar, until we can get some barriers, market, if you want to, spermicides, whatever you want. But right now, the state is just talking about it, which is pretty discouraging in my opinion, but it's the political sense. Nothing happens very fast.
I think we have a lot of questions and not many answers.
Yes.
The fish has been here almost 50 years and we still know almost nothing about it.
Yeah, what Jim was referring to is the WASPAR Economic or Environmental Council, so WBEC.com. It's actually a pretty interesting site. They got a lot of material in there.
So tag a dollar fee on every fishing license then, and earmark it specifically for research.
That's one of his suggestions. A boating license, a fishing license.
That's a good idea.
And
Put it
some
on
states have
everything
done
that
that.
goes into the water, onto the boats,
The
yeah.
state of Florida on fuel tax. I think there's 2 cents on every gallon of fuel in Florida sold at a marina, et cetera. That goes specifically to invasive species.
That may work there on, but most people here
Yeah, but the
run
concept-
smaller boats.
Yeah,
and-
but the concept of $2, a tax, whatever you want, to generate some funds. Because it's not just the fish to me, it's the real economic benefit for recreation, fisheries, whatever we do.
So what about you as a homeowner on the lake? Should we charge you an additional tax on that also?
Yes.
So we've been pushing a lot of criticism to states, but I'm wondering, what's happening at the federal level with regard, because if the state of, every state should be doing something, right? But if Tennessee's doing something, it doesn't matter if Kentucky's not, and if Alabama's not doing their part, right? So this really needs to be a federal conversation with the Army Corps, with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, so what's happening at that level? Where's the pressure being placed at that government level?
Alabama passed a statewide ban on live-bait transport last year in July.
The federal government's role has been largely kind of one-off injections of grant funding. But historically, invasive species management has been something that the states have taken up.
Yeah, I can answer that specifically. The major advisory committee for the federal government on invasive species was abolished by the Trump administration this past October. And the underlying entity, National Invasive Species Council, which is a branch of the Department of Interior, budget was cut in half. So that's what the federal government is doing about this.
Historically, the federal government's role has been to disseminate research, right? So they have seen it as their role to help share what has been learned in Illinois with other states, right? And so that's what they have kind of seen as their major role. They will occasionally provide these one-off fundings. I know under the Obama administration, there was some funding that went to the state of Illinois to keep carp out of the Great Lakes, but it's not a continued stream. But that's true of carp, but that's true of most invasive species, that controls of these things has been something that's been relegated to the states. Your point about getting back to the control question, though, is that there is obviously benefit to having a concerted federal control effort, right? Because if one state gives up and does less, then it's going to make it a lot harder for the neighboring state to do stuff. So it's hard. There is a constraint to having states go it alone, because you do need some concerted effort to try to do this on a regional basis, especially for aquatic invasives, where the state boundaries don't mean a damn thing, right? It's really the basin that matters. You should be putting together basin coalitions to attack this. And not just states, and those have formed organically, right? There is essentially a basin organization around the Great Lakes. Right. Tennessee's been working with Kentucky, obviously. So, I mean, the states recognize that they have to cooperate, but it's usually been some sort of organic coalition that forms between states that share these basins.
There's a war on carp in West Tennessee, and from what I know, the war on carp guys are doing more of the control thing than the prevention thing, and they installed a barrier at Barkley. I think they put a barrier in one of the $10 million barriers in behind the fish. Just like you said, the fish are already there.
Yeah.
So they're doing the wrong thing, and I applaud their efforts, but I think they're going about it the wrong way, and they're high on removing the fish, and they are getting some publicity on it, but I think the bow fishing was mentioned earlier. That's just a drop in the bucket when it comes to the actual biomass of these fish in the lakes. You get millions of tons of fish, and you pull out 10,000 pounds. So what?
Yeah. So what?
I just want to, you go back. Sorry. No, we go back. Okay, I'm on now. All right, you go back to the TWRA being a major factor in this for us in Tennessee. Is there a TWRA representative in the meeting? No, there's not. So that shows you, kind of gives you an idea of, that's all I gotta say.
Right, so I could do this all day, but I actually have to go to another class. So any last thoughts on this?
Well, we as the little people, living out in the Westmark Tellico Lake area, what today is practical for us to do?
I don't know that there's much you can do.
You could write letters, you can push your legislature.
You can
Push
yeah.
the governor.
Push the governor, your state legislator, your federal level, write letters. I mean, I don't know what else, you can't do anything physically on the ground at Watts Bar or at Calico's today.
I think, I'm kind of discouraged at the federal level, particularly the current administration. We can talk some more about that. But at the state level, your representatives, your senators, and the bloody governor, direct. Massive campaigns, set up meetings, go and write to them. Dr. Joseph has a resolution that a number of us in the area have passed and sent on to our representatives, including the governor. That's about all we can do. But if we do nothing, that's unacceptable in my opinion.
Send TWRA an email, ask them why they weren't here today.
well-
He was crappie fishing on a guided trip yesterday, Mike Jolly, so ask him why he wasn't here today.
Well, we've been dealing with TWR and some other fish issues. I've given up on those guys.
So I hate to kill this conversation, so please hang out and keep talking to one another. This is the kind of conversations that we need. But thank you all for coming today. This was great.